a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Louis Armstrong. Louis Daniel Armstrong, nicknamed Satchmo, Satch, and Pops, was an American trumpeter, composer, singer and occasional actor who was one of the most influential figures in jazz. His career spanned 5 decades, from the 1920s to the 1960s, and different eras in the history of jazz. In 2017, he was inducted into the Rhythm and Blues Hall of Fame. Armstrong was born and raised in New Orleans, coming to prominence in the 1920s as an inventive trumpet and cornet player. Armstrong was a foundational influence in jazz, shifting the focus of the music from collective improvisation to solo performance. Around 1922, he followed his mentor, Joe King Oliver, to Chicago to play in the Creole Jazz Band. In the Windy City, he networked with other jazz musicians, reconnecting with his friend, Bix Beiderbecke, and made new contacts, which included Hoagy, Carmichael and Lil Hardin. He earned a reputation at cutting contests, and moved to New York in order to join Fletcher Henderson's band. With his instantly recognizable gravelly voice, Armstrong was also an influential singer, demonstrating great dexterity as an improviser, bending the lyrics and melody of a song for expressive purposes. He was also very skilled at scat singing. Armstrong is renowned for his charismatic stage presence and voice almost as much as for his trumpet playing. Armstrong's influence extends well beyond jazz, and by the end of his career in the 1960s, he was widely regarded as a profound influence on popular music in general. Armstrong was one of the first truly popular African-American entertainers to cross over, that is, whose skin color became secondary to his music in an America that was extremely racially divided at the time. He rarely publicly politicized his race, often to the dismay of fellow African Americans, but took a well-publicized stand for desegregation in the Little Rock crisis. His artistry and personality allowed him access to the upper echelons of American society, then highly restricted for black men. Early life. Armstrong often stated that he was born on July 4, 1900. Although he died in 1971, it was not until the mid-1980s that his true birth date, August 4, 1901, was discovered by Tad Jones by researching baptismal records. At least 3 other biographies treat the July 4 birth date as a myth. Armstrong was born in New Orleans on August 4, 1901 to Mary Albert and William Armstrong. Albert was from Butte, Louisiana, and gave birth at home when she was about 16. William Armstrong abandoned the family shortly after. About 2 years later, he had a daughter, Beatrice, Mama Lucy, Armstrong, who was raised by Albert. Louis Armstrong was raised by his grandmother until the age of 5 when he was returned to his mother. He spent his youth in poverty in a rough neighborhood known as the Battlefield. At 6 he attended the Fisk School for Boys, a school that accepted black children in the racially segregated system of New Orleans. He did odd jobs for the Karnofskis, a family of Lithuanian Jews. While selling coal in Storyville, he heard spasm bands, groups that played music out of household objects. He heard the early sounds of jazz from bands that played in brothels and dance halls such as Pete Lawless, where King Oliver performed. The Karnofskis took him in and treated him like family. Knowing he lived without a father, they fed and nurtured him. In his memoir Louis Armstrong, The Jewish Family in New Orleans, Louisiana, the year of 1907, he described his discovery that this family was also subject to discrimination by other white folks, who felt that they were better than Jews. I was only 7 years old, but I could easily see the ungodly treatment that the white folks were handing the poor Jewish family whom I worked for. He wore a Star of David pendant for the rest of his life, and wrote about what he learned from them, how to live, real life and determination. His first musical performance may have been at the side of the Karnofskis' junk wagon. To distinguish them from other hawkers, he tried playing a tin horn to attract customers. Morris Karnofsky gave Armstrong an advance toward the purchase of a cornet from a pawn shop. When Armstrong was 11, he dropped out of school. His mother moved into a one-room house on Perdido Street with him, Lucy, and her common-law husband, Tom Lee, next door to her brother Ike and his 2 sons. Armstrong joined a quartet of boys who sang in the streets for money. He also got into trouble. Cornetist Bunk Johnson said he taught the 11-year-old to play by ear at Dago Tony's Honky Tonk. In his later years, Armstrong credited King Oliver. He said about his youth, "Every time I close my eyes blowing that trumpet of mine, I look right in the heart of good old New Orleans. It has given me something to live for." Borrowing his stepfather's gun without permission, he fired a blank into the air and was arrested on December 31, 1912. He spent the night at New Orleans Juvenile Court, then was sentenced the next day to detention at the colored waif's home. Life at the home was Spartan. Mattresses were absent. Meals were often little more than bread and molasses. Captain Joseph Jones ran the home like a military camp and used corporal punishment. Armstrong developed his cornet skills by playing in the band. Peter Davis, who frequently appeared at the home at the request of Captain Jones, became Armstrong's first teacher and chose him as bandleader. With this band, the 13-year-old Armstrong attracted the attention of Kid Ory. On June 14, 1914, Armstrong was released into the custody of his father and his new stepmother, Gertrude. He lived in this household with two stepbrothers for several months. After Gertrude gave birth to a daughter, Armstrong's father never welcomed him, so he returned to his mother, Mary Albert. In her small home, he had to share a bed with his mother and sister. His mother still lived in the battleground, leaving him open to old temptations, but he sought work as a musician. He found a job at a dance hall owned by Henry Ponce, who had connections to organized crime. He met the 6-foot-tall drummer Black Benny, who became his guide and bodyguard. Armstrong played in brass band parades in New Orleans. He listened to the music of local musicians such as Kid Ory and his idol, King Oliver. Riverboat education. Armstrong played in brass bands and riverboats in New Orleans, first on an excursion boat in September 1918. He traveled with the Band of Fate Marable, which toured on the steamboat Sydney with the Streckfus steamers line up and down the Mississippi River. Marable was proud of his musical knowledge, and he insisted that Armstrong and other musicians in his band learn sight reading. Armstrong described his time with Marable as going to the university, since it gave him a wider experience working with written arrangements. He did return to New Orleans periodically. In 1919, Oliver decided to go north and resigned his position in Kid Ory's band. Armstrong replaced him. He also became second trumpet for the Tuxedo Brass Band. Chicago and recording for Gennett. Throughout his riverboat experience, Armstrong's musicianship began to mature and expand. At 20, he could read music. He became one of the first jazz musicians to be featured on extended trumpet solos, injecting his own personality and style. He started singing in his performances. In 1922, he moved to Chicago at the invitation of King Oliver. With Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, he could make enough money to quit his day jobs. Although race relations were poor, Chicago was booming. The city had jobs for blacks making good wages at factories with some left over for entertainment. Oliver's band was among the most influential jazz bands in Chicago in the early 1920s. Armstrong lived luxuriously in his own apartment with his first private bath. Excited as he was to be in Chicago, he began his career-long pastime of writing letters to friends in New Orleans. Armstrong could blow 200 high Cs in a row. As his reputation grew, he was challenged to cutting contests by other musicians. His first studio recordings were with Oliver for Gennett Records on April 56, 1923. They endured several hours on the train to remote Richmond, Indiana, and the band was paid little. The quality of the performances was affected by lack of rehearsal, crude recording equipment, bad acoustics, and a cramped studio. In addition, Richmond was associated with the Ku Klux Klan. Lil Hardin. Armstrong urged him to seek more prominent billing and develop his style apart from the influence of Oliver. She encouraged him to play classical music in church concerts to broaden his skills. She prodded him into wearing more stylish attire to offset his girth. Her influence eventually undermined Armstrong's relationship with his mentor, especially concerning his salary and additional money that Oliver held back from Armstrong and other band members. In the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra, Armstrong and Oliver parted amicably in 1924. Shortly afterward, Armstrong received an invitation to go to New York City to play with the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra, the top African-American band of the time. He switched to the trumpet to blend in better with the other musicians in his section. His influence on Henderson's tenor sax soloist, Coleman Hawkins, can be judged by listening to the records made by the band during this period. Armstrong adapted to the tightly controlled style of Henderson, playing trumpet and experimenting with the trombone. The other members were affected by Armstrong's emotional style. His act included singing and telling tales of New Orleans characters, especially preachers. The Henderson Orchestra played in prominent venues for patrons only, including the Roseland Ballroom, with arrangements by Don Redman. Duke Ellington's orchestra went to Roseland to catch Armstrong's performances. Young musicians tried to outplay him, but split their lips in their attempts. During this time, Armstrong recorded with Clarence Williams, the Williams Blue Five, Sidney Bechet, and blues singers Alberta Hunter, Ma Rainey, and Bessie Smith. The Hot Five. In 1925, Armstrong returned to Chicago largely at the insistence of Lil, who wanted to expand his career and his income. In publicity, much to his chagrin, she billed him as the world's greatest trumpet player. For a time he was a member of the Lil Hardin Armstrong Band and working for his wife. He formed Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five and recorded the hits, Potato Head Blues, and Muggles. The word, Muggles, was a slang term for marijuana, something he used often during his life. The Hot Five included Kid Ory, Johnny Dodds, Johnny St. Cyr, Lil Armstrong on piano, and usually no drummer. Over a 12-month period starting in November 1925, this quintet produced 24 records. Armstrong's band leading style was easygoing, as St. Cyr noted, "One felt so relaxed working with him, and he was very broad-minded. Always did his best to feature each individual." Among the most notable of the Hot 5 and 7 records were Cornet Chop Suey, Struttin' with Some Barbecue, Hotter Than That, and Potato Head Blues, all featuring highly creative solos by Armstrong. His recordings soon after with pianist Earl Father Hines and Armstrong's trumpet introduction to and solo in West End Blues remain some of the most famous and influential improvisations in jazz history. Armstrong was now free to develop his personal style as he wished, which included a heavy dose of effervescent jive, such as "Whip That Thing," "Miss Lil," and "Mr. Johnny Dodds," or "Do That Clarinet, Boy." Armstrong also played with Erskine Tate's Little Symphony, which played mostly at the Vendome Theatre. They furnished music for silent movies and live shows, including jazz versions of classical music, such as Madame Butterfly, which gave Armstrong experience with longer forms of music and with hosting before a large audience. He began to scat sing, and was among the first to record it, on the Hot 5 recording, Heebie-Jeebies, in 1926. The recording was so popular that the group became the most famous jazz band in the United States, even though they had not performed live to any great extent. Young musicians across the country, black or white, were turned on by Armstrong's new type of jazz. After separating from Lil, Armstrong started to play at the Sunset Cafe for Al Capone's associate Joe Glazer in the Carol D. Cushion Orchestra, with Earl Hines on piano, which was renamed Louis Armstrong and his Stompers, though Hines was the music director and Glazer managed the orchestra. Hines and Armstrong became fast friends and successful collaborators. In the first half of 1927, Armstrong assembled his Hot 7 group, which added drummer Al "Baby" Dodds and tuba player Pete Briggs, while preserving most of his original Hot 5 lineup. John Thomas replaced Kid Ory on trombone. Later that year he organized a series of new Hot 5 sessions which resulted in 9 more records. In the last half of 1928, he started recording with a new group, Zutty Singleton, Earl Hines, Jimmy Strong, Fred Robinson, and Mancy Carr. Working during hard times. The Great Depression of the early 1930s was especially hard on the jazz scene. The Cotton Club closed in 1936 after a long downward spiral, and many musicians stopped playing altogether as club dates evaporated. Bix Beiderbecke died and Fletcher Henderson's band broke up. King Oliver made a few records, but otherwise struggled. Sidney Bechet became a tailor, later moving to Paris, and Kidori returned to New Orleans and raised chickens. Armstrong moved to Los Angeles in 1930 to seek new opportunities. He played at the New Cotton Club in Los Angeles with Lionel Hampton on drums. The band drew the Hollywood crowd, which could still afford a lavish nightlife, while radio broadcasts from the club connected with younger audiences at home. Bing Crosby and many other celebrities were regulars at the club. In 1931, Armstrong appeared in his first movie, X-Flame, and was also convicted of marijuana possession, but received a suspended sentence. He returned to Chicago in late 1931 and played in bands more in the Guy Lombardo vein, and he recorded more standards. When the mob insisted that he get out of town, Armstrong visited New Orleans, had a hero's welcome, and saw old friends. He sponsored a local baseball team known as Armstrong's Secret Nine, and had a cigar named after him. But soon he was on the road again. After a tour across the country shadowed by the mob, he fled to Europe. After returning to the United States, he undertook several exhausting tours. His agent Johnny Collins' erratic behavior and his own spending ways left Armstrong short of cash. Breach of contract violations plagued him. He hired Joe Glazer as his new manager, a tough mob-connected wheeler dealer, who began to straighten out his legal mess, his mob troubles, and his debts. Armstrong also began to experience problems with his fingers and lips, which were aggravated by his unorthodox playing style. As a result, he branched out, developing his vocal style and making his first theatrical appearances. He appeared in movies again, including Crosby's 1936 hit Pennies from Heaven. In 1937, Armstrong substituted for Rudy Vallee on the CBS radio network and became the first African American to host a sponsored, national broadcast. Reviving jazz with the All-Stars. After spending many years on the road, Armstrong settled permanently in Queens, New York in 1943 in contentment with his fourth wife, Lucille. Although subject to the vicissitudes of Tin Pan Alley and the gangster-ridden music business, as well as anti-black prejudice, he continued to develop his playing. He recorded Hoagy Carmichael's Rocking Chair for OK Records. During the next 30 years, Armstrong played more than 300 performances a year. Bookings for big bands tapered off during the 1940s due to changes in public tastes. Ballrooms closed, and there was competition from television and from other types of music becoming more popular than big band music. It became impossible under such circumstances to finance a 16-piece touring band. During the 1940s, a widespread revival of interest in the traditional jazz of the 1920s made it possible for Armstrong to consider a return to the small group musical style of his youth. Following a highly successful small group jazz concert at New York Town Hall on May 17, 1947, featuring Armstrong with trombonist/singer Jack Teagarden, Armstrong's manager, Joe Glazer dissolved the Armstrong Big Band on August 13, 1947, and established a six-piece traditional jazz group featuring Armstrong with Teagarden, Earl Hines and other top swing and Dixieland musicians, most of whom were previously leaders of big bands. The new group was announced at the opening of Billy Berg's Supper Club. This group was called Louis Armstrong and his All-Stars and included at various times Earl, Father Hines, Barney Bigard, Edmund Hall, Jack Teagarden, Trummy Young, Arvell Shaw, Billy Kyle, Marty Napoleon, Big Sid Catlett, Cozy Cole, Ty Glenn, Barrett Deems, Mort Herbert, Joe Darinsburg, Eddie Shue, and percussionist Danny Barcelona. During this period, Armstrong made many recordings and appeared in over 30 films. He was the first jazz musician to appear on the cover of Time magazine on February 21, 1949. A jazz ambassador. By the 1950s, Armstrong was a widely beloved American icon and cultural ambassador who commanded an international fan base. However, a growing generation gap became apparent between him and the young jazz musicians who emerged in the post-war era such as Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, and Sonny Rollins. The post-war generation regarded their music as abstract art and considered Armstrong's vaudevillian style, half musician and half stage entertainer, outmoded and Uncle Tomism. He seemed a link to minstrelsy that we were ashamed of. he called bebop Chinese music. While touring Australia, 1954, he was asked if he could play bebop. Bebop? He husked. I just play music. Guys who invent terms like that are walking the streets with their instruments under their arms. In June 1950, Suzy Delaire performed rehearsals of the song C'est si bon with Aimé Barelli and his orchestra at the Monte Carlo Casino where Louis Armstrong was finishing the evening. Armstrong enjoyed the song, and he recorded the American version in New York City on June 26, 1950. In the 1960s, he toured Ghana and Nigeria. After finishing his contract with Decca Records, he became a freelance artist and recorded for other labels. He continued an intense international touring schedule, but in 1959 he suffered a heart attack in Italy and had to rest. In 1964, after over 2 years without setting foot in a studio, he recorded his biggest-selling record, Hello, Dolly, a song by Jerry Herman, originally sung by Carol Channing. Armstrong's version remained on the Hot 100 for 22 weeks, longer than any other record produced that year, and went to number 1, making him, at 62 years, 9 months and 5 days, the oldest person ever to accomplish that feat. In the process, he dislodged the Beatles from the number 1 position they had occupied for 14 consecutive weeks with 3 different songs. Armstrong kept touring well into his 60s, even visiting part of the communist bloc in 1965. He also toured Africa, Europe, and Asia under the sponsorship of the U.S. State Department with great success, earning the nickname Ambassador Satch, and inspiring Dave Brubeck to compose his jazz musical The Real Ambassadors. By 1968, he was approaching 70 and his health began to give out. He suffered heart and kidney ailments that forced him to stop touring. He did not perform publicly at all in 1969 and spent most of the year recuperating at home. Meanwhile, his longtime manager Joe Glazer died. By the summer of 1970, his doctors pronounced him fit enough to resume live performances. He embarked on another world tour, but a heart attack forced him to take a break for 2 months. Armstrong made his last recorded trumpet performances on his 1968 album Disney Songs The Satchmo Way. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?